Section 1 of Mr Rowl, Part 1, The Happy Valley. Chapter 1, Le Jeune et Beau du Noir. Quote, Here is neither labor to be endured, nor danger to be dreaded. Yet here is all that labor or danger can procure or purchase. Look round, and tell me which of your wants is without supply. If you want nothing, how are you unhappy? End quote. Rasselas, Chapter 3. It was quite likely that at an earlier stage of the afternoon, the youthful and lively little company in the drawing room at Northover had been playing forfeits, or something equally childish. But when Mr. Rafe Bentley, the owner of Northover, strolled along the terrace about 5:30 with a couple of companions, they were making music, for a very pleasant tenor voice came floating through the windows, which, because it was a fine mid-March day, were slightly open. The voice was singing "Since First I Saw Your Face," and the middle-aged gentleman outside stopped to listen. "How very tuneful, egad," observed one of them. "Who's the minstrel, Bentley?" "Oh, judging from the R's, I should say it is our captive friend de Sablière," responded the master of the house with a smile. "Oh, don't you think so, Ramage?" "And the sun whose beams most glorious are," sang the voice, but the brow of the gentleman just addressed in no way resembled that luminary. "What right has a French prisoner to be singing English songs?" he growled. "Oh, if he must sing at all, let him keep to his own jargon." "Oh, but surely one should admire the Frenchman's enterprise," objected the first speaker. "And he sings the old song very well. Oh, how did he learn it, I wonder?" "Oh, better ask him, Sturgis," replied Mr. Bentley with a twinkle, as the unseen singer declared that where'er he went he would leave his heart behind him, and applause greeted the end of the song. "I'd almost asked you, Bentley," said Mr. Sturgis, who had only that day arrived on a visit to Northover, "what a French prisoner was doing, singing any kind of song in your house, having forgotten for the moment that Wanfield was now a parole town. You have a good few of Boney's officers here, I expect." "Oh, only about 80, not nearly as many as at Reading or Oswestry. Wanfield is quite a small place, as you know." "Oh, 80 too many," remarked Mr. Ramage, who seemed possessed by a grievance. "Oh, they are a damn nuisance, and Bannister, the agent, is too easy with them. Oh, hardly a week passes, but one of them breaks his parole, or is up to some dirty trick or other." "Oh, come, Ramage," interposed Mr. Bentley. "You exaggerate, my dear fellow. We've not really had a case since December 1812. Oh, since last year, in fact, when that major of engineers took the key of the fields, as I believe he would call it. Oh, he got clear off, too." "Yes, and how?" inquired Mr. Ramage indignantly, the very wig he conservatively wore bristling with indignation. "Oh, disgraceful to say, with English assistance. Oh, to think what some people will do for money, that for the sake of gain there should exist throughout the country a regular gang of escape agents who live by it as by a trade. Oh, but I've got my eye on that man Zachary Miller, peddler, poacher, and whatnot, and one day I shall catch him at his nefarious practices. Oh, I am convinced that it was he who was the go-between with Major Suchet and those even greater scoundrels on the coast." "Oh, Zachary Miller?" inquired a fresh voice, proceeding from a tall, fair, handsome gentleman of about 30, who had come unperceived along the terrace and joined them. "Oh, what about Zachary Miller? Oh, not poaching again, I hope. I had him up before me last month, but he managed to prove an alibi." Mr. Ramage turned eagerly to the newcomer. "Oh, not poaching, no, Sir Francis. I suspect him of something much worse. Only there again nothing can be proved against him." "Oh, Ramage thinks he's a sort of escape agent for the prisoners, Mulholland," supplied Mr. Bentley rather quizzically. "Oh, that is a somewhat more ambitious occupation than poaching." How a better paid one, anyhow, observed Sir Francis Mulholland. If you would tell me what you know about Zachary Miller, Mr. Ramage, I should be greatly obliged to you, for I'm tired of finding him prowling in my woods for no apparent reason. But let us remove ourselves for the purpose, since I know that Mr. Bentley finds it hard to believe anything to the discredit of the French prisoners. Oh, now, my dear fellow, protested his host, but Sir Francis, with a smile which seemed to show that he was only jesting, slipped his arm through that of the detractor of Zachary Miller, and they walked away, he inclining his head to listen to the gesture-emphasized disclosures of the smaller man. "Oh, that is Mulholland, of Mulholland Park, I take it," observed Mr. Sturgis to his friend. "Oh, I did not quite catch his name when you introduced us just now. I seem to remember that he had just succeeded his uncle in the estate when I visited you 2 years ago, but that he had not yet taken up his residence. The prospect, however, if I am not mistaken, was then causing a considerable flutter among the young ladies of the district and their mammas." Mr. Bentley smiled. "Oh, it was, and the flutter continued unabated until about 3 months ago, when he ceased to be the very eligible parti at whom they were all setting their caps." "Oh, ceased? Why?" "Oh, because he became engaged. And the mortifying thing to the fair of the neighborhood was that he laid Mulholland Park at the feet of no local aspirant, after all. Although, and this perhaps made it the more bitter, his chosen lady was staying at Wanfield at the time, in this house, in fact. Sir Francis Mulholland is betrothed to a very charming young lady, Miss Juliana Forrest, a school friend of my daughter's." "Oh, Juliana Forrest, Lord Falgrave's daughter?" "Oh, the same. She's one of the party in the drawing-room now, for she has been staying with Mrs. Mulholland, though she goes away the day after tomorrow, and then returns, I hope, to visit us here at Northover. Oh, don't fall in love with her if you can help it, Sturgis. I've a fancy that, though he tries not to show it, Mulholland is infernally jealous. Now he could hardly be jealous of an old man of 60. And so, they met here, at Northover. Oh, he was accepted last January, under this very roof. To be exact, I believe, in the small room off the drawing-room, where I keep my Chinese porcelain." Mr. Sturgis looked away for a moment. Sir Francis and his companion had disappeared round the corner of the house. "Oh, I should have thought, Bentley," he said slowly. "Oh, pardon an old friend, won't you? And that Mulholland and your own pretty girl. Oh, had you never thought of the match?" Mr. Bentley showed a heart-free smile on his daughter's account. "Oh, Letitia, my dear fellow, is going to marry her second cousin. And I'll try to believe that it is not a case of sour grapes. She does not greatly like Mulholland. Oh, I can't think why. Or possibly because, well, you know what girlish friendships are. Yet hers and Juliana's seems as strong as ever. In fact, I sometimes wonder how Sir Francis likes his betrothed spending as much time at Northover as, I'm glad to say, she does. And what he said when he heard that she was going to pay us, and not his mother, a visit in April. For where have he and Ramage got to, I wonder? Or some quiet spot where they can discuss the chance of getting this Mr. Zachary Miller transported, I imagine. Oh, it is transportation now, is it not? For helping a prisoner of war to escape. Oh, since last year, yes. But I cannot say that so far the fact has done much to deter escapes, though I suppose it has raised their cost. Oh, it is a very surprising thing to me, this inability of the French to respect their parole of honor. My old royalist friend, the Comte de Saint-Suzanne, who has been an exile for 20 years, and lived here for 12 of them, assigns it all, of course, to the spirit which came in at the Revolution. He says that the majority of these officers are destitute alike of breeding and of military tradition, so what can one expect? "You have a Frenchman of the other party living here," exclaimed Mrs. Sturgis with interest. "Yes, of course, I remember him now. How do the two kinds mix?" how about as well as oil and vinegar. The Comte ignores any Bonapartist prisoner he may happen to meet. Young de Sablière, who was singing just now, is about the sole exception. And I think he tolerates him only because he is of good family and has a pleasing address. Oh, it is a mercy that it is so, for Saint-Cézanne being such an old friend, and having the freedom of Northover, he and Mr. Rowl meet here fairly often. Oh, Mr. Rowl, queried his guest. And Mr. Bentley smiled. Oh, the shop people, and so on, who can't get their tongues around Monsieur Raoul de Sablière's family name, call him by that form of his Christian one. Oh, is Mr. Rowl the only one of the paroled officers who has the privilege of your hospitality? Oh no, I dare say there are about half a dozen others, but he is here the most frequently. A charming fellow, we all think him, even though he is an enemy. And when he was at large, I somehow fancy a pretty daring one. Not that he ever talks of his exploits. He's a hussar, and was wounded and captured at Salamanca last summer. They took a turn up and down. Someone was now playing the pianoforte with vigor. "Oh, that's Letitia," said her father. "We might go in when she has finished her performance." "Oh, before we do, and before the patriotic Mr. Ramage comes back," said Mr. Sturgis, taking his friend by the arm. "Oh, tell me something, my dear Bentley. I presume that here, as elsewhere, the prisoners are strictly limited as to where they may go. 1 mile along the turnpike road from either confine of the town being their boundary, eh?" Mr. Bentley nodded. "Well, my dear friend, when last I visited you in the first milestone, I distinctly remember the fact, stood a few yards to the left of your entrance gate, or between you and Warnfield. Now it is a few yards on the right. Has Northover shifted its position since 1811? How I understand that an earthquake tremor was felt last year in some parts of England." "It wasn't an earthquake, Sturgis. I had the distance from the town remeasured, and it was found to be slightly incorrect." And as Mr. Sturgis laughed and shook his finger at him, the good gentleman added half apologetically, "Oh, the poor devils have so few distractions. And as I'm a magistrate, and was actually deputy sheriff at the time of the correction, no one dared to say anything. Yet, some day." And here Mr. Bentley lowered his voice and glanced over his shoulder. "I half expect to find that Ramage has remeasured the distance yet again on his own account, and laid his discovery before another magistrate. A Mulholland, perhaps." "Oh, curious, if you come to think of it," said Mr. Sturgis reflectively, "that all over England and Scotland, these French officers on parole are living freely amongst us, and in many cases are received into our family circles." "Oh, and why not?" asked Mr. Bentley. "Well, they fought clean. Every soldier from the peninsula says that. Well, let us go in. I fancy that Letitia is drawing to the close of that newest display of fireworks of hers, the siege of Badajoz. If the actual event was really as noisy as that, I'm glad I was not there." It was a charming scene into which Mr. Bentley ushered the new arrival, with a wide, low room, whose last century chintzes still survived in this 13th year of the new, was brightened by groups in narrow, high-waisted gowns and sandals, in long-tailed blue or brown coats, and tight pantaloons and frills, the wearers of which, all young and all animated, seemed to be enjoying themselves hugely. And, now that the strains of Mr. Wesley's characteristic sonata no longer resounded, were making a good deal more noise than even the pianoforte had done. Letitia Bentley, a pretty, fair girl in white and yellow, still sat at that instrument, but she was looking up and talking to another of her own sex. Leaning against the pianoforte and studying some music outspread upon it was a young man of about 24, who caught the eye at once by reason of his unlikeness to any of the other young men present, and that not so much by his good looks as by his naturally more lively expression. His air of being able to set himself instantly in motion with a minimum of effort, like a well-trained runner or a deer. He was dark-haired but fair-skinned, with a suggestion of sunburn that had survived captivity and winter. His little moustache, so slight that it was hardly more than a penciled line across his lip, like that of a Stuart gallant, left the firm but sweet-tempered mouth revealed. Yet its mere presence sufficed to stamp him as not English. Well, that, of course, is Mr Rowl, said Mr Sturgis to himself. The sound of the door opening had been drowned in chatter, but suddenly Laetitia caught sight of her father and rose quickly from the music stool. The young Frenchman, too, raised his head and saw him, and his face lit up with a very pleasant smile. There was a general chorus of exclamation, and Mr Sturgis, welcomed a little shyly by his host's daughter, was presented to all the ladies severally, and before long found himself engaged in converse with her whose acquaintance had been specially promised him, Miss Juliana Forrest. She was a tall, dark, handsome girl, with a beautifully modelled head on a long neck, an exquisite mouth, and an air of race, a typical beauty, thought Mr Sturgis to himself, and with all the airs and graces of one, too, I'll warrant. But as he chatted to her a little, telling her how he had known her father at Cambridge, he found her not quite what he had looked to find, but more lively, natural, and open. More charming, in short, than he had surmised from his first glance at her. A little later, after he had been called away by Mr Bentley to be presented to someone else, he perceived that the young French officer, who, however, was not in uniform, had gone up to her where she sat in her long-sleeved gown of lilac sarcenet, spotted with amber, on a small couch in a corner of the room. She looked beautiful and animated. His face the observer could not see. Oh, making pretty speeches, of course, he reflected. A Frenchman's main idea of conversation with a woman. But if he could have overheard, he would have discovered the chief subject of the little interview to be quite other. So, too, might Sir Francis Mulholland, who, having just come in, was watching the couple, unobserved, from his place near the door. And so, you are leaving us on Saturday, mademoiselle, the young man was saying. Yes, for about a month, monsieur. But I shall find you here, no doubt, when I return. Raoul de Sablière made a little face. My chance of being exchanged is so small that I fear you will. Oh, pardon my ill manners. At any rate, I've something to look forward to. Your return, mademoiselle. I must strive, must I not, that my English, improved, I dare to hope, by the books which you and Miss Bentley have been so kind as to lend me, shall not fall away while you are absent. Your English is very good indeed, monsieur, said Miss Forrest, who had lent the young Frenchman books in that tongue, just because, speaking and understanding it so well, he had passed his childhood in England. He could appreciate them. That reminds me, how annoying. I'd intended before leaving Wanfield to lend you my copy of Rasselas, and to bring it here today, but I forgot. It is written, you know, in the most excellent style. You could not do better than study it. Oh, I should be only too delighted, said Monsieur de Sablière with an inclination. But, alas, I cannot come and fetch it from Mulholland Park, since that is out of bounds. Oh, so it is, agreed Miss Juliana. How vexatious. I must send the book, then, to your lodgings, by one of the servants. You lodge with Miss Hitchings, I think. Oh, but then I shall not be able to point out to you my favorite passages, as I designed. Oh, mais cela, c'est désolant, exclaimed the prospective reader. Oh, what is one to do? He could not, of course, suggest that she should accompany the book to his lodgings. The Honourable Juliana pondered. She was a very high-spirited young lady, accustomed to having her own way, and equally unaccustomed to having that way criticized, much less controlled, as a certain person was trying to control it at present. And still, to inform a young foreigner, whom, after all, she did not know very well, that she purposed coming to Northover tomorrow afternoon to take farewell of Laetitia Bentley. and to apprise him of her homeward route, in case he also should be taking a walk. No, even with so laudable an aim as the personal bestowal on him of Dr. Johnson's model of style, it would not do. Well, I must mark the passages before I send Rasselas to you, Monsieur de Sablière, was her conclusion, and Raoul had hardly bowed his acquiescence before a deputation of young ladies was upon him, begging him to sing again. A French song this time, and by preference a newer, since he had sung them so very antiquated an English air. Oh, heaven knew where he could have unearthed it. New? Repeated Captain de Sablière doubtfully. Oh, mais, chère demoiselle, where do you think I've been these last 3 years to learn the new ditties of Paris? How did you never sing in Spain, then, Mr. Rowl? Half mischievously inquired one damsel. Yes, hymns, replied Raoul with entire gravity. But before the protesting laughter had subsided, he admitted, Eh bien, yes, I know one new song. At least, it was new 2 years ago. I heard it first on the banks of the Kaya, Queen Hortense's ballad about Le jeune et beau Dunois, and Pardon pour la Syrie, in the time of the Croisades. I can play the air tant bien que mal. Bowing to Miss Forrest, he went toward the pianoforte, the little group following him with questions about the song and its writer, and Juliana Forrest was left alone in a corner, on which Sir Francis Mulholland immediately stalked across to her, his face rather thunderous. But Miss Forrest, if she noticed any meteorological symptoms, did not betray her knowledge, as she remarked evenly, "Oh, there you are, Francis." "Oh, there I've been for some time," returned her betrothed. "I was waiting until you were disengaged." His tone was not exactly disagreeable, but neither was it the tone of mere jest. Juliana shot a little glance up at him. That Francis was jealous, and sometimes insanely jealous, she had discovered about 3 days after her engagement. At first, the fact had amused her, but it had soon ceased to do so. But that was very unnecessary, she returned cheerfully. I, on my part, had been wondering where you were got to all this time. Oh, I did not observe any signs of solicitude. Had there really been any speculation in your mind, you could have seen me standing by the farther door these 5 minutes or so. Oh, my dear Francis, returned the girl with a shade of impatience. Oh, you surely do not desire to see me craning my neck in all directions to observe your whereabouts every moment that I've not the pleasure of your society. I would not wish to make either of us ridiculous. And, as you are now happily arrived, and pray sit down and listen to the new French song, which Monsieur de Sablière is about to sing to us. Sir Francis did not sit down. The word ridiculous had brought a slight colour to his cheek. "I've no desire to hear French songs. I came to ask you to give me a few minutes' private conversation. In the Chinese room over there, for instance." "Oh, willingly," replied Miss Forrest, "when the song is over." "Oh, hush, it is just going to begin. Oh, pray, Francis." Partons pour la Syrie, sang Mr. Rowl, seated at the pianoforte. Le jeune et bon du roi, venez prier Marie, de bénir ses exploits. Cette reine immortelle, lui dit-il en partant, qu'aimé de la plus belle, je sois le plus vaillant. And fidget and scowl though Miss Forrest's future lord did throughout the following 3 verses, he had to remain beside her. The moment, however, that the last note was drowned in applause, he gave her a significant glance, and going to a neighbouring door, held it open for her. Unhurriedly, the Honourable Juliana rose and passed through it, into a little room containing an old spinet, 1 or 2 fine Queen Anne chairs, and much Chinese porcelain, mostly imprisoned in cabinets. She turned on the young man as he shut the door behind him. "So, This is to be an interview en règle. We had another in here once. And she smiled, a delightful, roguish smile calculated, one would have thought, to dissipate the most obstinate male sulks. But what is it that needs such solemn precautions, and that cannot be said when we go home presently in your curricle? You forget the groom, replied Sir Francis rather shortly. He took a turn down the room, and then began to study a famille verte vase on its shelf, while Miss Forrest, sinking into a chair, watched him half mischievously. Juliana, he said at length, not looking at her, you may not like what I'm about to say to you, but I beg you to believe that I must say it. For if it is a duty, then I certainly would not keep you from its performance, said Miss Forrest equably. But pray proceed, or we may be interrupted before your task is accomplished. Thus adjured, the gentleman turned from the porcelain and faced her. I request you, when you return to Wanfield next month, to have nothing more to do with Captain de Sablière. The colour sprang up in Juliana's cheeks, and her hands went to the short walnut-wood arms of her chair. And the reason, pray? Because I do not like him, said Sir Francis with brevity. Oh, but if I do, well, I must still ask you to oblige me in the matter. Juliana returned her hands to her lap. I find him intelligent, amusing, and well-bred, she announced calmly. What have you against him? Oh, he is a French prisoner. And what does one know of a French prisoner's antecedents? Oh, Captain de Sablière is a gentleman. His name alone shows it, observed Miss Forrest. Oh, his name may not be his own. Oh, then his bearing, his manners show it. Even that fact does not make him a suitable companion for a girl of your station, Juliana. A girl of my station, Francis, is accustomed to judge of that for herself. Oh, pardon me, not in the case of a man to whom her future husband objects. No, perhaps not. If the man in question were really a companion, admitted Miss Forrest somewhat coldly. But look at the facts, Francis. I've seen very little more of Monsieur de Sablière than of any other prisoner at Wanfield. For indeed it is Letitia Bentley, and not I, who has had most of his society. I meet him occasionally at other houses, rather more often here, but always in company. As it happens, I've never spoken with him actually alone. How I should think not, indeed, commented Sir Francis between his teeth. Miss Forrest stopped in her discourse and looked at him. And of what, pray, would you be afraid if I were to find myself alone with a young man for a quarter of an hour or so? And do you realize, Francis, that you are making very strange and unflattering reflections on my character and upbringing? Her betrothed came nearer. Oh, do not try to misinterpret me so, Juliana, he protested, in a voice of mingled injury and indignation. You know that I'm doing nothing of the kind. But the idea of your being alone with that fellow for any length of time is outrageous. Do you not know what Frenchmen are? No, said Miss Forrest. A sprite appeared in her eyes. But now that you have excited my curiosity, I think I should like to find out. How, Juliana! She swept on, unheeding the explosion. But how a young man, even one of these terrible Frenchmen, conducts himself with a lady depends chiefly, I imagine, upon the lady. And do you think that she drew up her long neck and looked like Diana, that I am likely to allow any man to take liberties with me? Oh, not for a moment, Juliana, not for a moment, asseverated the jealous lover. Oh, but it is impossible to believe that a man exists who would not try to make love to you if he had the chance. Which, completed Juliana with a little smile, you do not intend that any man living but yourself shall have. He stooped over her and possessed himself of a hand. How can you blame me? No, I do not intend it. And you beautiful creature, when you accepted this. He kissed the gleaming ruby on her finger. You assented to that compact, did you not? Yes, said the girl, and I have kept my share of it. But in this matter of Monsieur de Sablière, you will do what I ask, will you not, my darling? He broke in, and made a movement as though to kiss her. And Juliana slipped instantly out of the chair. And then she turned to him, and her look was grave. No, Francis, it is as useless trying to cajole me as it is to dragoon me. Day by day, this ridiculous and quite causeless jealousy of yours is growing more insupportable. Now it is this man, now another. Soon I shall be able to speak to none under the age of a grandfather without incurring your frowns. I've tried to be patient, but now I see that it is culpable in me to give way to you, that by doing so I'm preparing a sort of slavery for myself. For I am an Englishwoman, and you are not living in Turkey, as you sometimes appear to think. An attack so direct plainly staggered Sir Francis Mulholland. He seemed to be about to make a fiery retort. Then he lost his balance and countered lamely. So my wishes have no weight with you. Oh yes, certainly they have, for they are reasonable. But to forbid a perfectly innocent acquaintance with a well-behaved and rather lonely young man whom chance has thrown in my way. Lonely, ejaculated her affiance, recovering himself. And that foreign nightingale in there, lonely. And chance, indeed. Was the part he took with you in those theatricals last month due to chance? Miss Forrest's gravity relaxed. No, to talent, she retorted, as he happened to be the only young man in the neighborhood who did not look uncouth and absurd, disguised as a woman. Oh, his selection was due to you. Do not deny it. Oh, certainly not. I'm proud to think that it was Monsieur de Sablière as the gypsy girl who was the success of the evening. Oh, especially in the scene with you. I watched you both, Juliana. Oh, I should hope you did. I was told I looked very well as a woodcutter's daughter. And though, if you had condescended to act yourself, as you were requested, Francis, you would not have been under the painful necessity of looking on, if it was painful. Sir Francis stifled some remark which sounded remarkably like a curse. Oh, Juliana, for God's sake, drop this levity. It is trifling with a serious question. You are... She interrupted him firmly. You quite misapprehend, Francis. I'm not trifling, far from it. It is indeed a serious question. You are trying to impose on me a perfectly unreasonable demand. And leaving aside that it is unreasonable in itself, how do you suppose that, when I come to stay in this house, I'm to avoid meeting a guest who frequents it as much as Monsieur de Sablière does? Stay in my room, by your orders, when this dangerous foreigner is announced. Or ask Laetitia to have him refused entrance, and tell her why. He would have to be told, too, and might be flattered at your apprehensions, I imagine. Sir Francis, darkly red, was gripping the back of a chair. Juliana, he said thickly, are you trying to see how far you can go with me? No, answered she, her head very high. Only trying to show you how far you go, to lengths which, 3 months ago, in this very room, we could neither of us have foreseen, I think. Mulholland's colour suddenly faded to real pallor. The words seemed to hold a veiled threat. But he had no opportunity of ascertaining this, for, with a good deal of preliminary rattling, it is true, the door leading from the drawing-room opened, and their host apologetically put his head in. Oh, I'm so sorry, but they are clamouring for you, Juliana, in there, and I could deny them no longer. Do not hate me, my dear. Juliana went to him and put her hand through his arm. Oh, I think you come at a good moment, Mr. Bentley, she said, and, without a glance at her betrothed, entered the drawing-room. But, as that gentleman instantly discovered, the bone of contention was no longer there. Part 1, Chapter 2. Mr. Rowl gets into trouble. Quote, pride is seldom delicate. It will please itself with very mean advantages. End quote. Rasselas, Chapter 9. After finishing his warmly received rendering of Queen Hortense's ballad, Monsieur Raoul de Sablière had removed himself with what speed he might from the neighbourhood of the pianoforte, for he was a modest young man, and had no desire whatever to monopolize attention, and particularly in the anomalous situation which was his. With the idea of suggesting to Miss Bentley that the time had come for her father to sing them "A Hunting We Will Go," as his custom was, he sought for her among the little groups, and soon descried her in a corner, talking to a very erect old gentleman, at the sight of whose back he stopped and bit his lip. But at that moment the old man turned round, revealing a deeply marked, austere countenance with piercing blue eyes. His hair was snow white, his clothes, spotless as they were, had seen long service. He wore a ribbon in his buttonhole. "Ah, a French song for once, Monsieur de Sablière, but unfamiliar to me for all that," he said, with a courteous little inclination. "A pretty air, though I did not hear the words as I should have done had I been younger. May I ask what it was?" The singer's colour rose faintly. "And no, you would not know it, monsieur," he answered quickly. "It is new, only 2 or 3 years old. Mademoiselle, I came to ask if Mr. Bentley—" But Miss Bentley, disregarding his haste to leave the subject, ill-advisedly pursued it. "Monsieur de Sablière ought to tell you about it, Comte, as he was telling us just now, for it is so interesting. The song was written by a queen, words and music, too, by Queen Hortense." The old royalist raised his eyebrows. "And pray, who is Queen Hortense?" The little smile that accompanied the question was so acid that Miss Letitia realized, too late, what delicate ground she had thus rashly invaded. I forget. Is she not Queen of Westphalia, or is it—" She faltered, stealing in her confusion a glance at Monsieur de Sablière, only to find that he, looking fixedly at his compatriot, was frowning, a phenomenon she had never witnessed in him before. "Your ignorance, my dear Miss Letitia," said the Comte de Saint-Cézanne, with an intensification of his double-edged manner, "is fully excusable, since I, a Frenchman, share it. But Monsieur de Sablière can no doubt enlighten us, if indeed it be worthwhile. Or rather, enlighten me, since I see your father making signs to you over there." It was true, and Letitia, after a rather troubled glance at her 2 French friends, left them together. Immediately she had gone, Raoul de Sablière remarked very stiffly in their common tongue, "I should hardly have thought it was worth your while, monsieur, to affect ignorance of the identity of Her Majesty the Queen of Holland." "Oh, I beg your pardon," replied the old man. "Oh, the Queen of Holland, thank you. But I am, you see, no botanist. I am not well acquainted with the nomenclature of the mushroom tribe." "Oh, really, Monsieur de Saint-Cézanne," exclaimed the young hussar angrily, "you exceed the bounds of—" "And you, Monsieur de Sablière, are obviously aware of no bounds at all. So, lest you should be contemplating rendering any further compositions by the self-styled monarchs of that family, I will betake myself to the library. As far as I am concerned, you will then be free to sing the Ça-ira, if it pleases you." And, brushing aside the young man's half-stupefied protest, he marched to the door, an attempt on Raoul's part to follow him being neatly frustrated by the intervention of 2 ladies and a very young gentleman who beset him with supplications. "Oh, Monsieur de Sablière, do not go away, please. We want you to give us a translation of the words you say. Here is Miss Curtis, who understood but half, and Mr. Molyneux, who understood none." The very young gentleman blushed. "And I, who had but the vaguest idea of what it was all about. The marriage of Dunois. Oh, was there not a marriage? Appeared so sudden." "It was a reward for his, what we call prouesse," stammered Raoul, the English word evading him for a moment under the blue lightning shaft which was launched at him just before the door closed on the Comte de Saint-Suzanne. He tugged angrily for a second at his tiny moustache. Preposterous behavior, and all for what? And then he recovered himself, and the smile, which was never far from it, twitched the corners of his mouth. How sudden. Yes, mademoiselle, a little. In war, you know. But I will translate from the beginning. And with one elbow on the mantelpiece, he rendered the words of the romance into English, laughing himself when he came to de ma fille Isabelle, sous le pou à l'instant. And unaware of another listener, Mr. Sturgis, who had drifted to that corner of the room and was thinking to himself as he watched the scene. How strange, how natural and easy they are, in these French. How graceful young beggar. How pity he's not in uniform. And no, perhaps on the whole just as well. Young ladies are so susceptible. But light, unreliable, of course, like all his nation. For Mr. Sturgis had no great first-hand knowledge of the French. And yet, mademoiselle, he heard the expositor conclude, and the English chanson, which I murdered to you just now, is worth 6 of Le Jeune et Beau Dunois, for it is real feeling. This is pasteboard. Oh, you are quite right, sir, observed Mrs. Sturgis, coming forward. I had the pleasure of hearing you sing, since first I saw your face, and you certainly brought out that feeling. There was a little twinkle in his eye. But the young man was a match for him. He betrayed no sort of embarrassment. On the contrary, he observed with a candid smile, "Oh, mais, monsieur, one must feel what one sings, must one not, even when in truth one does not feel it at all." "Oh, Monsieur de Sablière," exclaimed the eldest of his little audience in a disappointed tone. "How unromantic! And we who were thinking while you sang of the lady with whom you left your heart over there in France, and compassionating her for your absence." "Oh, but you need not have done that, mademoiselle," remarked the young hussar. "Oh, she will certainly have consoled herself by now, if she ever existed," he added, with a mischievous smile which showed his even little teeth. But a young lady at the piano had now begun to play what she proclaimed to be an adagio and march in the Turkish style, and under cover of it, Captain Raoul de Sablière of the 3rd Hussars slipped quietly from the room with the intention of finding and making his peace with the Comte de Saint-Suzanne. But he himself could not regard his alleged offence very seriously. Indeed, if he were not so much the younger man, it might well be his to demand an apology. Nor did he think the old royalist need to have hurled the Saïga at him in that ridiculous manner, as if he had ever sung it, or, indeed, had ever heard it sung. But ce vieillard-là imagined that one was still in the year of blood, 93. Whether this was true of him or no, ce vieillard-là himself had something the outward appearance of belonging to that vanished world, where he stood choosing a book from a case in Mr. Bentley's library, the light from the branched candlestick in his hand falling kindly on his silver hair and worn aquiline features. He looked round as Raoul came in and put down the candlestick, his mouth tightening for an instant. "I've come to offer my apologies, Monsieur le Comte," said the young soldier, standing rather erect, "for what I'm sure you must be aware was a perfectly unintentional offence. And having done so, I would permit myself to tell you, with all respect, that I repudiate the sentiments and associations of the Saïga quite as strongly as you do, and that to credit me with the intention of singing it." But Monsieur de Saint-Suzanne put up his delicate old hand. "I am already ashamed of my speech, Monsieur de Sablière. I have a hasty temper, still imperfectly controlled, I fear, for all my long apprenticeship to adversity. I ask you to forgive my outburst, and, if you can, to forget it." "How willingly, monsieur," returned Raoul, immediately mollified. I hope, in turn, that you will believe I never meant to hurt you. Nobody can do that now, Monsieur de Sablière. He turned his astonishingly blue, keen gaze more fully on his young compatriot. But a very few, can make me feel regret, and you are one of them. Oh, I do not need to tell you why. If I did not think the climbing rose outside this window here a fine plant, I should not be so sorry to see the blight on it, summer after summer. For my only son, Monsieur de Sablière, was about your age when he was killed 20 years ago at Rulzheim, serving with Conté. And indeed, he was not at all unlike you in voice and bearing. But, though life has never been the same for me since his loss, nothing can take away from me the consolation of knowing that he fell as his forefathers fell, and under the same flag which had led them so often to victory. If you had been killed in Spain, could that have been said of you? How I should have fallen for France, monsieur, returned Raoul proudly, and been glad to give my body for her. None of my ancestors, or yours, did more. What does it matter whether the flag which wraps a French soldier bears the lily or the eagle? Monsieur de Saint-Cézanne made a gesture. Monsieur de Sablière, there is the blight I lament. How do you think it immaterial that you can so lightly give the title of queen to the half-Creole wife of an upstart who is barely a Frenchman, when she who last bore the title in France? His voice sank and died. He turned away, as from the scaffold he could never cease to see. "Ah, but monsieur, we are not now in the Terror," exclaimed Raoul. "Had I been born when your son was born, it would have been very different with me. How should I not also have served that beautiful and unfortunate lady? But because of outrages and crimes which took place when I was a child of 3 or 4, events of which I have not even a memory, must I be inactive all the best years of my life? I wanted to be a soldier, to fight for my country, for France of today, the new France. 20 years ago, I should have fought for the old. Is it my fault that I am, as you no doubt consider, born 20 years too late?" The old royalist turned once more and looked at him as he stood there, young, ardent, handsome, and argumentative, and his face softened a little. "Oh, it is extraordinary, the way you resemble him," he murmured almost inaudibly. "Mais lui, il avait la tête blonde, aussi blonde." Well, we will not discuss it, Monsieur de Sablière. I am too old to listen to new creeds, and you, I suppose, too young to understand mine. One particular of the old, however, I am glad to think that you observe more punctiliously than some of the new defenders of France, who have made a Frenchman's word of honor worth less than a pinch of dust in England today. Every time that I hear of a fresh case of parole breaking, I feel as if I could never hold up my head in an Englishman's presence again. "And do you suppose, monsieur," cried Raoul, with his own head held rather high, "that I do not feel exactly the same as you about it? Are you insinuating that I hold lightly a thing which, on the contrary, I regard with absolute abhorrence, and that any soldier must so regard, the breaking of a sacred word of honor? Of the 680 officers who have broken it in the last 3 years alone were all soldiers or sailors," observed the Comte dryly. "No, indeed, as I say, I do not think any such thing of you. But with such examples, who knows?" And not unnaturally, this qualifying of the testimonial stung the young hussar to a sharper annoyance. "When you hear that I've actually disgraced myself, Monsieur de Saint-Cézanne, it will be time enough, will it not, to reproach me? And to anticipate that day is only to—" He broke off, controlling himself before age and misfortune. "I wish you good evening." To reach the library at Northover, one had to traverse another room, never used nowadays, except for this one purpose. But as Raoul de Sablière emerged into this apartment, he was aware of a tall man standing looking out of the far window, though it was almost dark outside, with his hands behind his back and a little the air of waiting for someone. And when he was halfway across the rather dimly lighted room, this individual turned and revealed himself to be Sir Francis Mulholland. "Ah, Monsieur de Sablière, good evening," said Le Roi Soleil, as Raoul had christened him among his French associates. "May I have the pleasure of a word with you?" So, it was he who was awaited. Raoul, trying to digest his annoyance with the Comte de Saint-Suzanne, and at no time particularly desirous of conversation with this gentleman, with whom he had scarcely exchanged 10 words in his 6 months at Wanfield, was obliged to reply, "With pleasure, sir," and managed to do this with his usual politeness. On that, finding that Sir Francis did not move from the window, he went towards him. "What I have to say is a little difficult," began the owner of Mulholland Park, scrutinizing him closely. "Oh, I trust that you will not take offense at it." "I am not in a position, sir, to indulge the luxury of taking offense," responded Raoul non-committally, but wondering what on earth was coming next. "Ah, your speaking thus of your position makes it easier for me," was Mulholland's next remark, though his manner did not suggest that he was finding difficulty of any kind. "Since you already realize, then, Monsieur de Sablière, and that it is not quite that of the other guests at Northover, perhaps the merest hint that you might with advantage carry that fact still more in mind may be enough." Raoul looked at him, 3/4 bewildered. "To what end am I to carry it in my mind?" he asked shortly. "Well, to take an example," said Sir Francis, with a little smile which he perhaps intended to be deprecating. "We all realize that you have a pleasing voice, but it is possible, you know, to have too much of a good thing." Raoul colored. "Oh, you mean that I talk too much?" "Oh, I should not venture to express an opinion on that point," returned Le Roi Soleil with an air of diplomacy. "I was referring rather to your vocal gifts, and the exercise of which, forgive me, you're certainly not sparing. 2 songs in the space of half an hour, and neither of them, if I may say so, in the best of taste, all things considered." "Oh, monsieur, I think you are impertinent," said Raoul sharply. Sir Francis shrugged his shoulders. "Oh, I warned you that my errand was unpleasant." "Oh, errand?" Raoul took him up. "Who sent you on that errand? Oh, not Mr. Bentley, I'm sure." "No, I've no commission from Mr. Bentley, though I think that, for your own sake, he would approve of what I'm saying. For my only desire, if you would but believe it, is to present you, out of goodwill, with a hint." "Oh, I do not take hints from you, sir, whatever prompts them," said Raoul, drawing himself up. But Sir Francis, from his superior height, looked across the embrasure at him with an Olympian air which was hard to stomach. "Oh, that is a pity, Monsieur de Sablière, because it would really be better, again for your own sake, that you should reflect whether your very frequent presence at Northover is not putting too great a strain even on Mr. Bentley's hospitality." Naturally sweet-tempered as he was, Raoul began to feel that this was too much. "Oh, the day that Mr. Bentley himself," he began warmly, but Sir Francis bore him down. "Oh, Mr. Bentley, as you well know, is too kind-hearted ever to suggest such a thing. Oh, let me put another consideration before you, then. How do you suppose that it is a source of satisfaction to the gentlemen of this neighborhood to find a person of your nationality present at almost every gathering, and usually in a position of prominence, which his own better feelings should have led him to avoid?" Now, this indictment, wounding as it was, might, for all the young Frenchman knew, have some truth behind it, though he had never observed the slightest signs of ill will towards him among the local gentry, with many of whom he was on excellent terms. And he had always been most careful not to push himself forward. Still, if there were one or two who disliked him... But while he stood silent, honestly trying to face such a possibility, Sir Francis saw fit to follow up his advantage by adding, in the most openly insolent manner, "You're only here at all, you know, on sufferance." Raoul could not suppress a little gasp. "Thank you for the so courteous reminder," he said. And then he gripped the edge of the card table in the window and became dangerously quiet. "You will tell me, please, whether in doing me this kind office you're speaking for yourself alone, or whether you have been deputed by others to insult me." "And I also should like to be informed on that point," said a level voice behind them, and both, turning round in surprise, beheld the Comte de Saint-Cézanne on the threshold of the library. "Oh, I take it, Sir Francis," he continued, coming forward a little, "that the recommendation you have just so tactfully made to Monsieur de Sablière applies to me also, a Frenchman, an exile, and a habitué of Northover. I'm only sorry that my reliance on Mr. Bentley's ever-ready welcome has led me, like my young fellow countrymen here, to offend Mr. Bentley's other guests. You may be sure that I shall make him and them the profoundest apologies." If the young fellow countryman had been in a laughing mood, he might have enjoyed the stupefaction and then the patent alarm of his aggressor. "Oh, Monsieur le Comte," stammered the Roi Soleil, leaving the window. "Oh, I beg of you. My remarks were of course not meant. I was not aware." And then, "If you do not wish Mr. Bentley to know how unjustifiably you've been trying to dictate to one of his guests in his house," said the old man sternly, "I suggest that you immediately apologize to Monsieur de Sablière for your last very gross observation." No, a forced apology is of no use to me, Monsieur de Saint-Cézanne," cried Raoul quickly. "And, for my part, I would point out to this gentleman that since he so much dislikes my visits here, the remedy is simple. He can seize his own." "How you impudent!" began Sir Francis, taking a step towards him. But the old man broke in sharply. "Oh, Monsieur de Sablière, look at the clock, there. You have but just time to take leave of the company and to reach your lodgings before curfew. That obligation takes precedence of everything else at this moment." Raoul's eyes had instinctively followed his pointing finger, and he saw indeed that the tall clock in the corner marked 20 minutes to 7, and by 7 he must be back under the roof of Miss Eliza Hitchings in the little town. "Oh, thank you, monsieur," he said to the old royalist, with a mixture of real gratitude and of regret at having to quit the field of battle. "And thank you still more," he added, in his own tongue, "for your generosity just now in classing yourself with me. I shall not forget it." He bowed to him, looked at Sir Francis in no pacific fashion, and remarking, "We must finish this conversation, sir, another time," left the room. He was excessively angry, but it was imperative to bottle down his wrath for the moment, since he must return to the drawing room and make his farewells without an instant's delay. As he hurried towards that apartment, he rejected the idea of slipping out of the house without taking leave, not only because it would be discourteous, but also because Sir Francis, if he heard of it, might draw very incorrect conclusions as to the effect of his admonitions. No, good manners at any cost, even if he all but burst with the constraint he was putting on himself as he opened the drawing-room door. Afterwards, he was to think how differently things might have gone if he had not made that sacrifice to politeness and pride. His re-entry into the lighted drawing-room was hailed with questions as to where he had been and reproaches for his absence. His smiling, shaking his head, and reminding his critics that a good prisoner had to be home by 7 o'clock this month, and that he should have to run most of the mile to the town as it was, he made his way to Miss Bentley and apologized for his hasty leave-taking. "All right, my boy," said Mr. Bentley, coming up from behind and clapping him on the shoulder. "Oh, Letty quite understands. Go off with you. But be sure you come extra early on Tuesday to make up, that's all." "Oh yes, you've not forgotten Tuesday, I hope, Monsieur de Sablière," inquired Laetitia anxiously. "For the concert, you know." No, it did not seem as if the Bentleys, at all events, felt that he trespassed too often upon their hospitality. Nor that Miss Forrest, the most beautiful girl in the room, resented his presence there, alien though he was. The sun whose beams most glorious are, rejecteth no beholder. For as, his farewells over, he made for the drawing-room door, she chanced to be standing near it, alone. Or at any rate she was near it, alone. "I must bid you a month's farewell, mademoiselle," said the young man, with lightly feigned solemnity. But the words of the song wove themselves unuttered about his own as he looked at her, though he hoped that that sweet beauty past compare did not cause his gaze to be too bold. "Oh, do not, I pray you, forget your kind promise to send me the romance of Dr. Johnson, to make that month seem less long." And to this, looking him in the face, Miss Juliana replied calmly, "I've been reflecting about Rasselas, Monsieur de Sablière, and tomorrow afternoon I intend to come to Northover again, to take farewell of Miss Bentley. I will put the book in my pocket, just in case I should be walking back, and should come across you. Should you, for instance, by any chance be fishing near Folly Bridge, where I think I've heard you say that you do fish sometimes." The young Frenchman dropped his eyes, not to show his surprise. Did she know what she was doing? She seemed extraordinarily composed about it. And why was she doing it? She, Le Roi Soleil's betrothed. But it was not for him to hesitate. "Oh, you're quite right, mademoiselle," he replied without a perceptible pause. "Although it is off the high road, I've a special license from Mr. Bannister to fish for a mile from the bridge. And, as it happens," he looked at her again, and his eyes were sparkling now, "I had already arranged with myself to go and fish there tomorrow afternoon, so that if by chance you should be taking that way back to Mulholland Park." He left the sentence unfinished and added, "For, I believe, that path which mounts the steep field from the bridge goes to Mulholland Park, does it not?" "Oh, it does," answered Miss Forrest, looking at the carpet for a moment. "What is the shortcut?" She then added, in a highly negligent manner, "Oh, it is, of course, quite uncertain whether I shall return that way." But Raoul de Sablière, bending over her hand and murmuring that he, at least, would be there, was conscious of a distinct hope that, whatever motive had prompted her to this unconventional suggestion, she would be able to carry it out. And when, rather out of breath, he reached Miss Hitching's doorstep, just as the first clang of the prisoner's curfew smote the air, it was evident that the smothered wrath to which he had promised himself to allow free play, as he hurried towards the lights of Wanfield, had occupied him but little, or his first action on opening the door would scarcely have been to tap the weather-glass in the little hall. Part 1, Chapter 3. How Juliana asserted her independence. Quote, "Even the happy valley might be endured with such a companion." End quote. Rasselas, Chapter 13. Mr. Rowell's unspoken petition had certainly been granted. The 19th of March was an even finer afternoon than its predecessor. A thought too fine, indeed, for a fisherman whose heart had been set wholly upon sport. But then, Mr. Rowell's heart was not so set. The stream sang as it rippled under the little stone bridge, whose presence almost raised it to the status of a river, and the birds were singing, too, in the coppice that topped the meadow on the farther side, and then flung down a tributary line of thicket almost to the water. And all over this thicket, and everywhere else, the green was breaking in varying degrees of eagerness, a promise of what would reward the eye if one came again in a week or so. The young man on the bridge at present, however, had his back turned to all this display, since, leaning his arms on the parapet, He was looking meditatively down at the water. His fishing rod rested against the same support, for Monsieur de Sablière had really been fishing conscientiously, though fruitlessly, in order to delude anyone who might witness it, or possibly even himself, into the belief that this pre-arranged meeting with Miss Juliana Forrest was just a chance encounter. If Miss Forrest came, that was, for today she might think better of her design. Of course, the conventions were not quite so easily outraged for an English girl as for a French. He knew that. And besides, she might have a lawful escort with her, since it was not likely that Sir Francis would allow her to walk back from Northover unaccompanied. In that case, did she intend to make the gentleman wait while she pointed out to a French prisoner her favourite passages in Rasselas? If so, having regard to his recent conversation with that prisoner, there might be interesting developments. More possibly, she meant to come unescorted, which, if Le Roi Soleil learnt afterwards of their open-air study of English, might lead to more interesting ones still. Almost undoubtedly for his own sake, and just possibly for Miss Forrest's too, it would have been well to decline this encounter. But how could he put such an affront upon the lady who, whatever her motive, had been kind enough to propose it? And such a proceeding, especially after Sir Francis's attempt to read him a lesson, would have been of a prudence to make Monsieur Raoul Marie Amédée de Sablière blush all the rest of his life at the remembrance. If Le Gros Mulholland accompanied her, and Raoul really did not see how on this, her last afternoon at Ronfield, she could avoid his escort, and dare he throw that gentleman into the stream, as, after yesterday's impertinence, he would so greatly enjoy doing. He dallied with the idea, leaning there on the bridge, knowing perfectly well that he could not do such a thing in Miss Forrest's presence. D'ailleurs, Sir Francis was much the bigger of the two. But what a souse he would make going in! The poor little river would be completely dammed by Le Gros Mulholland. How unfortunately it was not deep enough to drown him. It was all very well to indulge in these pleasant fancies, but what of his future relations with Sir Francis, quite apart from any possible complications which might be imported into them by this afternoon's interview with his lady-love, if he came to know of it? On one thing, however, he was determined, that he was not going to be bullied by him out of his footing at Northover. In the midst of these reflections, he caught the sound of a light step approaching, and turned eagerly. In another moment, Miss Juliana Forrest came round the corner of the bend, and she was unaccompanied. Raoul swept off his hat and went to meet her at the end of the bridge. Miss Forrest wore a long, close-fitting coat of cherry colour, edged all round and up the fronts with ermine, but from just below the bosom, where it was tied about with a ribbon, it fell a little apart and showed her white cambric walking dress. She was looking very charming, the more so that her own colour was undoubtedly a trifle heightened. "Oh, Miss Forrest, as I live," exclaimed the young man. "Oh, what pleasant surprises fate can give an unlucky fisherman, after all." And Miss Juliana smiled, and coloured yet more at this disingenuous address. "Oh, you have not caught anything this afternoon, then, monsieur? Oh, I am sorry." "Oh, you have no cause to pity me, mademoiselle," returned Raoul, looking at her and smiling too. He was still bareheaded, and the breeze lifted his fine, dark, loosely curling hair, and the sunlight showed the laughter and vitality in his grey eyes, with their rims of still darker grey. And suddenly Miss Forrest seemed to find the little bridge too bright a place to stand and talk with a young man, for she began to move across it. "Oh, mademoiselle," said Raoul, moving with her, "you were going to point out to me the beauties of Le Docteur Johnson. But remember that I cannot accompany you up that path to the little wood. Only by the river may I disport myself, and that solely by permission of the good Mr. Bannister." And she hesitated and looked down the stream. It was clean out of her way. Raoul read her thoughts quite well. "I've never been along that path," said the Honourable Juliana. "You would find it quite dry," observed Raoul, glancing at her thin footgear. "Then I think I will take a turn there." "And I may have the privilege of accompanying you?" inquired Raoul, "since Monsieur le Docteur comes too." He glanced at the reticule upon her arm. "And I have my fishing rod," he added, laying hold of it. Under the tutelage of these two chaperones, therefore, they left the bridge and started along the little track by the river bank, which was just wide enough for Juliana's slender feet in their kid half-boots. Under Raoul's, the grass swished pleasantly, and for a moment or two, that was the only sound the couple made. Could Juliana Forrest herself have said what had caused her to do this thing? Hardly. A pique, a desire to show her betrothed that he could not dictate to her. A desire, in short, to read him a lesson. But it is of no use reading a person a lesson unless he is aware of the process, and Juliana, being conversant with Sir Francis's movements this afternoon, which she had had no small share in determining, knew that he would not pass by Folly Bridge. But she always had it in her power to tell him of what she had done, if she saw fit, since not for one moment did she regard this as a clandestine proceeding, to be hushed up. Miss Juliana Forrest did not condescend to behaviour of that sort, nor, certainly, had she been the least in the world in love with Monsieur de Sablière, or he with her, would she have suggested handing over Rasselas in this manner. Monsieur de Sablière was a friend, in whom she took a friend's interest, and whom she might meet whenever it seemed good to her. So, after they had gone a short way, she opened her reticule and held out a small volume. "Ah, the famous book," said Raoul, and read off the title. Rasselas, Prince of Abyssinia. Il était donc prince, les héros du bon docteur. Miss Forrest assented, and Raoul tucked his rod under his arm, the better to examine the book, as they walked slowly along. "But he was a captive, then, in the hands of his enemies, this prince?" inquired the young Frenchman after a moment. "Oh, a captive, but not in the hands of his enemies," replied Miss Forrest. And she explained how, according to the author, it was customary for the children of the royal race of Abyssinia to be confined in a delightful valley until they should succeed to the throne. Her hearer listened attentively, but he did not fail to mark at the same time the fineness of her profile, and the way her lashes lifted themselves after their downward sweep. How green the boughs were behind her head, and how good the air smelled. "Oh well, this Rasselas cannot have had a pleasanter captivity than mine," he observed, at the end of this exposition. "You are all too kind to me here, mademoiselle. All except Le Gros Mulholland," he added to himself. "Oh, then I hope," said Juliana gently, "that you can sometimes forget your captivity." In the flash of an eye, the mobile visage had changed. "No, mademoiselle, I never forget it," said the young hussar quite simply. "Oh, yes, the restrictions are ridiculous," agreed Miss Forrest sympathetically. "What is 1 mile along the turnpike to a man? You must often long to walk in the fields. And then that curfew." They were at a standstill now. "It is not those little things," said Raoul, shaking his head. "You, mademoiselle, will understand me, I think, when I say that I did not put on the Emperor's uniform in order to use this." He indicated his fishing rod. "Every day I become older, is it not, doing nothing. 8 months have gone by." He broke off. 8 months, repeated Juliana, struck by his tone. 8 months since Salamanca, your last battle, and the most terrible, perhaps. And there by the stream she looked at him with new eyes, realizing that he was, after all, a soldier, and, amusing and accommodating though he might be, evidently had a preference for a soldier's life, with all its hazards. No, mademoiselle, he now replied, not the most terrible. Salamanca, where I was taken prisoner, was the greatest battle in which I had the honor of participating, but Albuera, the year before, was more bloody. Albuera, exclaimed Juliana. Was it not at Albuera that there was that terrible cavalry charge, which almost wiped out I forget how many of our regiments in a few minutes? Or so I've heard. Yes, said Raoul, and there was a sudden violent hailstorm, which helped us. And he added, looking away, you must try not to hate me too much, mademoiselle, but I was in that charge. Juliana was not conscious of any violent aversion. But I'm sure that you, Monsieur de Sablière, were not one of the lancers who afterwards rode down and massacred our wounded. No, I forgot. Of course, you're not a lancer. Oh, I hope, said the young man, with rather a wry smile. That is not the only ground on which you are sure of it. Then he faced her squarely. Oh, to tell the truth, mademoiselle, and I'm glad to be able to tell it, it was not French troops at all who were guilty of that atrocious conduct. It was the Poles who had just charged, the lancers of the Vistula. But I cannot deny, to my shame, that it occurred. I was able to intervene in the case of one officer, and I was fortunately successful. But the lancers were beside themselves, and it was not very easy. He broke off, looking meditative. Back, Juliana could see, on the field of battle again. Oh, Monsieur de Sablière, she exclaimed, how grateful that officer must have been to you. Did you know his name? Oh, we had no time to exchange cards, mademoiselle, said Raoul, smiling. He was, of course, made prisoner, and I did not see him again. I do not even know his regiment, except that it belonged to the brigade we had just charged. But do not let us talk of battles, since in doing so we must realize that we are enemies. How must we? Asked Juliana with a smile. Even here. Oh, do you know, monsieur, that from every officer returned from Spain whom I've ever met, and I've met not a few, I've heard the same praises of the enemy. Ah, mademoiselle, said Raoul, bowing, vous me rendez confus. May I say that sentiment was not confined to the one side? Yes, one exchanged courtesies, gifts sometimes. One even had one's friendships with a foe. Oh, as in the times of chivalry, said Miss Forrest with sparkling eyes. When I read those wonderful poems of Walter Scott's, how I wish I could lend you Marmion. I feel that if I had been born a man, I should like to go to the wars. But there must be much hardship as well as glory. Oh, tell me, Monsieur de Sablière, how long had you been in Spain before your capture? About a year and 8 months, replied Raoul. I joined my regiment, the 2nd Hussars, at the end of 1810. It was part of the 1st Corps, Marshal Victor's, under Soult. And I was fortunate enough to be present at the Battle of the Gibora in February 1811. Or perhaps you may not have heard of it. He permitted himself a rather malicious smile here, for it was an undisputed French victory against the Spaniards, bien entendu. At the Gibora, it is a river, mademoiselle. We destroyed the army of Estremadura, and then Badajoz surrendered to us. Yes, I know that you have stormed it since Salamanca, but we had held it against you for more than a year. And then came Albuera, of which I've spoken. Then Marshal Soult joined Mahmoud, and both armies lay for a fortnight on one side of the river Caya, with Lord Wellington on the other. How I used to long for the attack, but the day never came. At the Caya, I was transferred to the 3rd Hussars, which formed part of Curto's light cavalry division in Mahmoud's army, and being thenceforward with Mahmoud instead of with Soult, I came to be at Salamanca, and so find myself here at Ronfield. You were wounded at Salamanca, were you not? Asked Juliana. I hope you received proper attention from our surgeons. I was very well cared for indeed, thank you, mademoiselle. And my wound was not serious. I was lame for a little, that was all. how did you come to England? Oh, it could not, I fear, have been an agreeable voyage. Monsieur de Sablière's mouth tightened a little. No, it was horrible. We were crammed on the transport like sheep and battened down most of the time. But at any rate it came to an end, and the conditions could not be helped. You took so many prisoners, alas, at Salamanca. But I gained some idea of the horrible conditions, which, you must pardon me for saying, could be avoided, under which so many of the less fortunate of us are rotting in your hulks today. Oh, the hulks, said Miss Forrest with a shiver. Oh, do not let us speak of them. I've heard things. No, too horrible. If they are true, they are a disgrace to us, to England. Raoul, touched that she could feel for misfortunes which she had never witnessed, and which in any case were suffered by enemies, was about to say something of the kind, when he became aware that a man was walking along the more frequented path on the opposite side of the stream, and that he was not unobservant of them. He looked across and saw the Comte de Saint-Suzanne. Miss Juliana Forrest saw him too. For the second time since her coming, her colour rose a little. For the second time she took an added beauty from it. She acknowledged the Comte's salutation, and Raoul did the same, unable to decide whether he could detect on his compatriot's face, across the width of the stream, an indication of the surprise which he was probably feeling. In silence, they both watched him continue his path away from the bridge, and Raoul suddenly remembered that at the beginning of this interview he had half expected somebody else to break in upon it, and realized, too, how completely he had since forgotten that anticipation. As for Saint-Suzanne, he was not the man to go gossiping. "Oh, tell me, mademoiselle," he said, for the sake of saying something, for a shadow of constraint seemed to have fallen across them both. "Does this Rasselas," he touched his pocket, "ever escape from his happy valley?" "Yes," replied Juliana, beginning to move in the direction of the bridge. "He makes a way out, and leaves it in the company of a sage and a lady. Oh, but the lady is his sister," she added, with the suspicion of a smile. "Who do not expect to find a romance of love in so edifying a work as Rasselas. If you want that, you must ask Miss Bentley to lend you Richardson." "Oh, but surely Monsieur le Docteur Johnson could have rendered even a romance of love edifying," protested the student. "Yet, perhaps, for purposes of escape, a sister would be a more suitable companion. That is, some kinds of a sister. One like mine, for instance." "You have a sister, monsieur?" "Yes, mademoiselle. Au plus haut degré même. I mean that I have a twin sister." Miss Forrest was much interested. She had never met a twin, and said so. "Does your sister resemble you very much?" "Not so much, perhaps, as one pea another in the same pod, which I believe is expected of twins," answered Raoul, laughing. "But we have changed clothes, Adrienne and I, in our younger and wilder days, and no one been much the wiser." He smiled, as at some reminiscence, and Juliana knew that he was thinking of his home. Presently, indeed, he began to speak of it a little, of his father, who was old, and old-fashioned in his ideas, not moving with the times, but regretting the past. Yet a better father no one could have, mademoiselle. Of his mother, loved by everyone who came near her, and not least by me, as you can imagine. "Oh, I've not seen her for nearly 2.5 years," he went on. "I had leave from Spain once, in the winter, but there was not time to get farther than Bayonne, and we live in the Orléanais. My little mother was ailing. She could not undertake the journey. My father was anxious, and stayed with her. It was a great disappointment. But Adrienne came. She travelled all by herself across 2/3 of France, in the snow, and the diligence broke down too, at Dax, but it would take more than that to stop her. So we met in Bayonne, on the jour de roi and were very happy for 24 hours. They walked on in silence after that, Miss Forrest thinking how simple and modest he was under his lively exterior. This terrible Frenchman who had not made the slightest attempt to take advantage of her rashness, which proved that she had not been rash. So it was a great thing to him to meet his sister, but she could not help wondering a little whether there were not any other lady whom he would have liked to meet as well in Bayonne on 12th night. The bridge was nearly reached again when she said suddenly, "Since I'm going away tomorrow, may I ask you what I fear may sound an impertinent question?" "Oh, pray ask me anything, mademoiselle. It could not be impertinent." "I've had it in my mind for some time," confessed Juliana, looking down and playing with her reticule. And now, the sight of old Monsieur de Saint-Susanne has revived it. "How is it, Monsieur de Sablière, and that you, a gentleman of a family no doubt as old as his, find yourself?" "I find myself an officer of the Emperor's," completed Raoul as she hesitated. "Oh, mademoiselle, if when you say 'find yourself' you think that it was due to an accident or to necessity, I must tell you that it was not fate, but my own choice, which has made me serve the greatest soldier that even France has produced. And I'm not singular in that. He has many better known names than mine on his rosters. But when the choice is made you, though surely without your recognizing it or willing it, the enemy of your own class, your own traditions, your own king." Raoul looked intently at her. It was a strange coincidence to be taken to task for this delinquency 2 days running. Yet it was flattering that this young English lady should be sufficiently interested in him to demand an explanation when the action evidently caused her some embarrassment. He tried to explain his position. They were at the bridge again by the time he had finished. "Her France is young, mademoiselle," he urged in conclusion. "Always young, although she is so old. There's sap in her veins, ever springing up. And it comes up from the root. My family is not a newcomer, not a graft on that tree. The new sap runs through it also. And now, Monsieur de Saint-Susanne, though I respect him deeply for what he has suffered, I cannot but think of him and his fellows as dead boughs, dropped off. The Bourbons, too, a withered branch. France does not need them anymore. It is sad. I regret it, though less than my parents regret it, yet more than my sons will regret it when their time comes. Tout tombe, tout pousse à jamais, c'est la loi de la forêt." "Yes," said the girl thoughtfully. "I understand a little better. You forgive the question, I hope. And now I must go on my way." She held out her hand. Raoul de Sablière kissed it. "You have been in everything too good, mademoiselle. I shall, I promise you, read every word of Rasselas with the care it deserves. I wish you an agreeable journey tomorrow." "The best I could wish you, Monsieur de Sablière," said Juliana, looking at him with great kindness, "is that on my return I should find you gone on a journey across the Channel. But I suppose there's small chance of that." Raoul shook his head with a smile. "Yet there are consolations in every lot. I shall be able to restore your book to you." He assisted her over the stile and watched her progress up the sloping meadow path where he might not accompany her. When the cherry color and ermine had vanished over the brow, he returned to the bridge and started to take his rod to pieces. But he had hardly got the first joints apart when he heard a faint scream from the direction of the meadow. Raoul did not wait for its repetition, but, dropping his rod, vaulted over the stile and ran up the path like a hare. And the cry came again as he ran, and joined to it his own name. Je viens, he called out, and burst into the thicket to find a rough-looking man struggling with Miss Juliana Forrest for the possession of her reticule. Part 1, Chapter 4. Fortune favors thee. Quote, "Your ignorance was merely accidental. which, being neither your crime nor your folly, could afford them no reason to applaud themselves, and the knowledge which they had, they might as effectually have shown by warning as betraying you. End quote. Rasselas, chapter 9. All this while, Sir Francis Mulholland was returning towards his mansion and his betrothed in no sunny frame of mind, and he undoubtedly had a grievance, for Juliana, on this, the last afternoon of her stay, had absurdly insisted on going yet again to Northover to take a final and solitary farewell of her dear Letitia. After yesterday's scene, and the ominous words with which it had concluded, the lover thought it better to affect complaisance. He obtained the privilege of at least escorting his lady to Mr. Bentley's door, though he was not allowed to enter, nor to wait, nor to call for her, being given to understand that the exact moment of her return was uncertain, and that Mr. Bentley and Letitia would perhaps walk back with her. He could occupy himself, he was told, by going on to Stoneleigh to see the horse for sale there, as he had several times said he was anxious to do. Not too enthusiastically, Sir Francis had agreed to this, and was even now returning from a long interview with the quadruped in question. His shortest way home from Stoneleigh lay by the turnpike road, and by the turnpike alone he would have proceeded thither, had he not fallen in at the crossroads with Mr. Ramage riding, or at least sitting, on his old flea-bitten cob, taking his usual afternoon's airing. And Mr. Ramage had implored him to accompany him a little on his own homeward path, which, though it lay at an angle to the coach road, would not take Sir Francis very much out of his way if the latter continued by the shortcut over Folly Bridge. It appeared that Mr. Ramage had something about which he wished to consult him. So Sir Francis consented, and all the way down the lane, Mr. Ramage confided to him his suspicions that Morris, the tallow chandler's prisoner, had a habit of leaving his lodgings at 6 o'clock in the morning, which was strictly against regulations, and his own conjectures as to why he so left them. It could not be to find mushrooms in March. "Or tell Bannister about it, then," counselled Sir Francis, rather bored. "That is what he's here for, to keep an eye on the prisoners." Mr. Ramage retorted that he greatly feared one, at least, of Mr. Bannister's eyes was a blind eye, but that he himself was certainly going to do his duty and warn him about the suspected activities of Zachary Miller, whom this very afternoon the speaker had seen with his own unobscured vision, sitting in his peddler's cart, talking to two of the French prisoners near Four Oaks Farm. Why? But Sir Francis Mulholland, beginning to regret his yesterday's interview with this zealous gentleman, concealed a yawn, and, having come to a convenient point, bade the suspect hunter farewell, and resumed his solitary course and his ruminations about Juliana. In his own fashion, he loved her, and he prized her even more than he loved. And the more valuable an object, the more acute is one's apprehension of loss. He was inconsistent, no doubt, in his violent and at times all-embracing jealousy, and for he had far too good an opinion of Sir Francis Mulholland to imagine that his destined wife could prefer another to him, least of all this foreign other whom he had made his latest subject of torment. Lord Falgrave's daughter was not in the least likely to fall in love with a penniless, if good-looking, French prisoner. Oh, but it enraged him that she should even allow the Frenchman to talk to her, while to have the audacity to confess that she found pleasure in his conversation, and to refuse to abandon the acquaintanceship. Acquaintanceship, indeed. It was more than that. What of those damned theatricals last month, with that cursed foreigner in a petticoat and shawl, sheltered by Juliana, the woodcutter's daughter, in her cottage, and then turning out to be a man after all? And some ridiculous, romantic farrago it was, everybody with a name ending in O or A. Its only merit that at least the petticoated young man was not the titular hero, and did not make love to Juliana. a proceeding which was very stiffly gone through by that nincompoop Elwell, of whom not even Sir Francis, who could be jealous. And that ball at Vaughanfield Assembly Rooms in January, shortly after their betrothal, at which, for the first and only time, de Sablière had appeared in his dashing hussar's uniform, how confound him, and had danced twice with Juliana, how confound him still more. Because it was useless to deny that the silver, grey and scarlet set off his looks and figure to great advantage, and one knew what women were about regimentals, and Sir Francis had overheard plenty of appreciative comments that night from some of the ladies, if not from Juliana. How damn it all, was there no way of getting rid of that hussar fellow while Juliana was away? His attempt to put a spoke in his wheel yesterday evening had been worse than a failure. If only he could use a little quiet influence to get him transferred to one of the other parole towns. But that, preeminently the wisest course, was also preeminently the most difficult, because de Sablière never misconducted himself, and Bannister, the agent, had a strong regard for him, and would never lend himself to intrigue against a well-behaved member of his not always amenable flock. But, though as yet he knew it not, Sir Francis was under the guidance that afternoon of some tutelary spirit. By sending Mr. Ramage across his path, this demon, good or bad, had withdrawn him from the high road, and forced him to take the route by Folly Bridge, and the short-cut up the meadow to Folly Copse. Not content with guiding his steps, it had also timed them to the best advantage. Yet, even when Sir Francis saw a partially disjointed fishing rod lying by the parapet of the bridge, he was not aware of this. He merely wondered who could have left it there. When he was halfway up the sloping path, however, he saw a man coming out of the copse. As there was a right-of-way through it, the sight did not surprise him. But in another moment, his pulses gave a leap. For surely that was de Sablière himself, who was coming so unconcernedly towards him. Oh, it was. Bannister's model prisoner, out of bounds at last. Oh, what luck! What unbelievable good luck! De Sablière's head was bent, for he was twisting a handkerchief round the knuckles of one hand, and so he did not at first see who was approaching him. But when he raised his head and did see, it was obvious, to Sir Francis's gratification, that he was by no means pleased. "Good afternoon, Monsieur de Sablière," said the Englishman, grimly polite. "So your fishing license has been extended to cover Folly Copse. Oh, I hope you had good sport there." The offender met his gaze quite boldly. He did not look at all ashamed of himself, but rather hot and untidy, and his neckcloth was disarranged. "I know that I am, strictly speaking, out of bounds," he replied coldly. "But I assure you that I had an excellent reason for it." And, stepping off the path, he passed his enemy. But he was not going to get away so easily. Sir Francis turned round after him. "Then I should like to hear that reason, sir." The Frenchman slackened his pace, but did not stop entirely. "Oh, it does not concern you, Sir Francis Mulholland," he observed over his shoulder. "Ah, but I think you will find that it does. You forget, perhaps, that I am a justice of the peace, Monsieur de Sablière." This time de Sablière did stop and faced round. "No, I know it quite well," he retorted, "but that fact does not justify you in questioning me. If I have to give an explanation, I shall give it to the proper person. I wish you good afternoon." And, turning on his heel, he resumed his progress down the slope. Sir Francis watched him go. "Oh yes, you will be asked for that explanation, my fine fellow," he said, under his breath, exhilarated by his good fortune. "And by George, I think you will find it devilish hard to give." Turning on that very quickly, as one struck by a brilliant idea, he ran up the rest of the slope, plunged into the copse, and searched it from end to end. There was no one there, least of all Mr. Zachary Miller, whom he was hoping that some further grace of the gods would enable him to find. Nevertheless, some half-hour later, Sir Francis was back in Wanfield and entering the private residence of Mr. James Bannister, the agent responsible to the transport office for the prisoners of war on parole in that place. Raoul, meanwhile, had gone straight home with his fishing rod to his little room off the High Street, under the roof of Miss Eliza Hitchings, that acidulous-looking female, of whose cold eye he mendaciously declared himself to be in perpetual terror. This apartment was not a palace, and he was without the means to render it more attractive, for which he consoled himself by the reflection that he would not have dared to do so if he could. He had at present nothing but the weekly sum allowed by the British government to officer prisoners of war, because, on its recent augmentation from 10 and 6 to 14 shillings, he had promptly forbidden his family to send him any more remittances, as he was now living in affluence, which was far from being true. But though, when in straits, he would sooner cut down the expenses of his commissariat than endanger the irreproachableness of his outward appearance, and would tell Miss Hitchings that such and such a purchase need not be made that week, only hoping that the good lady would not guess the reason. Miss Hitchings of the unsmiling countenance had much better ground, on her side, for being sure that Mr. Rowl had not the faintest suspicion of how many loaves of bread and pats of butter he was never charged for at all. It was not often that Mr. Rowl, being popular, returned home before he was obliged to do so by his parole regulations, which in the present month of March demanded that he should be indoors by 7, as the Comte de Saint-Suzanne had reminded him yesterday. From May till June, he was looking forward to being free till 9. The 3 winter months, however, had seen him driven to his fireside by 5 o'clock. So Miss Hitchings was a little surprised when she heard him come in now, the clock marking only 5:15, and by the fact that he did not run upstairs as he usually did. Raoul was in fact rather worried as he mounted that narrow staircase and came into his ugly little room. What devil of ill luck had sent Sir Francis up the path just at that moment? As far as Raoul himself was concerned, it would have been less damning if Mulholland had come on him a few minutes earlier by the bridge, conversing though he were with Miss Forrest. The Englishman might have disliked that, but he could not urge it against him as a crime. On his way home, the prisoner had in fact debated whether he should not do well to go and inform Mr. Bannister that he had for a short space gone out of bounds, and why. Bannister would believe and absolve him, he felt sure. For the matter of that, Sir Francis must have absolved him, too, if he had told him the reason. Perhaps he had been foolish to give him no inkling of it, since indeed Mulholland, far from blaming him, ought in the circumstances to be deeply grateful. Raoul did not, however, feel sure that he would, exactly, for he had an intuition that Miss Forrest had somehow manipulated circumstances, in other words, her betrothed, in order to return alone by Folly Bridge. At the moment, with no time to spend on weighing pros and cons, it had seemed natural to cover Miss Forrest's traces. Sir Francis would probably hear soon enough of what had happened in Folly Copse. He might even have come on the tramp or poacher, or whatever he was, though to be sure the latter had vanished very quickly indeed, after he had picked himself up. And proceedings, it was true, had opened with a somewhat scrambling corps-à-corps encounter, after Raoul had torn him away from Miss Forrest, but the end had been more in style, though he himself had broken his knuckles over it. Miss Forrest had been shaking so much when it was over that he had been obliged to support her to a tree stump, on which she had sunk down, while he knelt beside her and fanned her. It was the only treatment he could think of, with his hat. And really, she had looked almost more beautiful when she was as white as a lily. But she was never near swooning, he thought, except perhaps just for the first second or two after he had disposed of her assailant. That first second or two in which she had clung to him. Moments which, neither at the time nor in retrospect, were at all disagreeable ones. In the end, he had escorted her to the boundary of the Mulholland domain, and just before they parted, she had said, in a voice full of emotion, would you care to keep my little Rasselas for your own, in memory of my undying gratitude? So Miss Forrest's book was now his, a memento of an episode which would have been wholly pleasurable to contemplate if it had not been for the encounter with Mulholland, on top of yesterday's, too. But Raoul now put Sir Francis resolutely from his mind, and ensconcing himself in his one fairly comfortable chair, took out the book in question from his pocket. By the absence of any sounds from the room above, were lodged another prisoner, a naval lieutenant named Lamont. He surmised that the latter was not home yet. He had invited him to partake that evening of a hare recently presented to him, which, as its arrival almost coincided, of course unknown to the British donor, with the second anniversary of the birth of the little King of Rome, would be treated as a commemorative feast on the eve of the event, combining in one both dinner and supper. It was a pity that Miss Hitchings had insisted on cooking the animal tonight, on the ground that it would keep no longer, for the birthday was not till tomorrow. As every well-conducted reader should, Raoul began at the first page, and the stately and beautifully rounded exordium impressed him as much as Miss Forrest herself could have desired. Ye who listen with credulity to the whispers of fancy, and pursue with eagerness the phantoms of hope, who expect that age will perform the promises of youth, and that the deficiencies of the present day will be supplied by the morrow, attend to the history of Rasselas, Prince of Abyssinia. And soon he was reading of the delights of that blissful place of captivity, the Happy Valley, with its remarkable floral and zoological riches, and the even more remarkable juxtaposition of the latter, since on one part were flocks and herds feeding in the pastures, on another all the beasts of the chase frisking on the lawns, and the sprightly kid was bounding on the rocks, the subtle monkey frolicking in the trees, and the solemn elephant reposing in the shade. A momentary reflection that the Happy Valley must have been rather like the Jardin des Plantes in Paris, and the student, struck with the justice of these last epithets, repeated them several times to himself. Then he went on to read of the human inhabitants, who wandered in gardens of fragrance and slept in the fortresses of security, and by 6 o'clock had reached the passage in the 4th chapter, where Rasselas, carried away by a daydream of that outer world which he has never seen, actually pursues the imaginary robber of an imaginary damsel, whom he pictures as appealing to him for help, until he is brought up short by the foot of the impassable mountain hemming in the Happy Valley. Here he recollected himself, and smiled at his own impetuosity. Then, raising his eyes to the mountain, "This," said he, "is the fatal obstacle that hinders at once the enjoyment of pleasure and the exercise of virtue. How long is it that my hopes and wishes have flown beyond this boundary of my life, which yet I've never attempted to surmount?" The incident, in more ways than one, had sufficiently close a resemblance to what had happened to Miss Forrest and himself in Folly Copse that afternoon, to make Mr Rowl lay down the book and smile. But the smile had a spice of melancholy. In his situation, just as much as in that of Dr. Johnson's hero, was a fatal obstacle that hinders at once the enjoyment of pleasure and the exercise of virtue, his parole. And it was more insurmountable than Rasselas's mountain. No doubt he was fortunate that his military rank entitled him to the indulgence, but nevertheless, comparative ease and pleasant society had to be paid for, in the same coin in which Rasselas paid. Wanfield was rather like the Happy Valley. Upon this reflection, the door opened, and Miss Hitching's voice observed, in a somewhat minatory manner, "Mr. Bannister to see you, sir." The reader jumped up, as there entered the retired chemist, who was his very good friend and custodian. "I was thinking about you, sir," exclaimed Raoul. "If I had not been sure that you would have left your office, I think I should have paid you a visit this afternoon." "Well, you see that I am paying you one," returned Mr. James Bannister rather heavily, as he took a chair. "And I wish I had not to, but I did it rather than send for you. Oh, I expect you know what I've come about. You are the last man I thought I should have trouble with on such a score." Raoul stood looking down on him with a slightly heightened color. "You wish to know why I was out of bounds this afternoon? On my honor, Mr. Bannister, I could not avoid it. I had to go, as you will acknowledge when you hear the circumstances. But first, who told you of my crime?" "You can guess, I should think. Sir Francis Mulholland." Raoul made a face. "Oh, he has not lost much time. Well, I suppose he was able to tell himself that he was doing his duty. But as it was on account of a person in whom he is deeply interested that I had to transgress, his zeal is a little misplaced." "What do you mean? What person?" "Sir Francis said nothing," began the agent. No, I told him nothing. The sheep reserves the tale of its misdemeanors for its own shepherd," announced Raoul cheerfully, bestowing a smile on the gentleman in question and sitting down on the arm of a chair. "Voyons donc." And he proceeded with his tale, a strictly truthful narrative in all but its suppression of Miss Forrest's previous whereabouts. By the end of this recital, Raoul's shepherd looked decidedly relieved. "Oh no, my dear fellow, you certainly could not have done anything else. But why the deuce didn't you tell Sir Francis about Miss Forrest?" "Because he had no right to demand an explanation of me," replied the champion. "Oh, I said that to the right person I would give one, if necessary." "Oh, but you see, you hothead, if you had done it there and then, he would not have lodged information against you for breaking your parole." "How breaking my parole?" exclaimed the young soldier indignantly. "How dare he suggest—" "But I suppose I was breaking it, in a sense," he finished in some dismay. Mr. Bannister laughed. "Technically, perhaps, but certainly not in the spirit, if that is all you went out of bounds for." "I hope you do not think it was for any other reason, Mr. Bannister," rejoined Raoul rather gravely. No, I take your word for it, without reservation," said the agent. "But Sir Francis, who does not know you as well as I do—" "Yes?" inquired Raoul, with an odd light in his eyes. "Sir Francis suspects. Now, pray don't run away with the idea that I suspected. He imagines that you had gone into Folly Copse to meet some escape agent or other." Raoul gave a short, angry laugh. "Oh, he has an imagination, and that one. Oh, certainly I had a meeting with a man in the copse, and I think he will remember the fact, but not pleasantly. I myself also." He showed his grazed knuckles. Mr. Bannister got up. "Well, I'm only too glad that you can give me such a satisfactory explanation. And as Sir Francis must by now have received from the lady concerned her account of your chivalrous conduct, I hope we may think of the incident as closed. But till he formally withdraws his charge, which, as he is a magistrate, I'm bound to take rather seriously, you would make things easier for me if you would engage not to leave your rooms till I tell you that you're free to do so." "But with pleasure," agreed Raoul. "I will constitute myself the prisoner of Miss Hitchings. I will see Sir Francis and get the matter cleared up with him, tomorrow morning, if possible." "Oh, you have taken a weight off my mind, de Sablière. I've so much to try me, one way and another, between your countrymen and my own. but I've always felt that you were one of those whom I could fully trust," concluded Mr. Bannister. "Thank you," said his charge. "I shall try always to deserve that opinion." They shook hands, and the agent departed, leaving the young Frenchman to reflect with indignation upon Sir Francis's action. He saw his game quite well. He had seized on this opportunity to do him an injury because, as yesterday's collision had made abundantly plain, he resented his presence in Wanfield society. However, when he knew the truth, he would find this weapon broken in his hand. Moreover, as Raoul's own conscience was clear, and the agent could not, regard the matter seriously, there was nothing that need cloud his and Lieutenant Lamotte's enjoyment of the commemorative hare, upon which they very cheerfully supped, nor of their game of cards afterwards, in which Raoul lost with equal cheerfulness, since tomorrow was payday, the whole of his remaining weekly income, namely 1 shilling sterling, and his mimicry of an imaginary scene in which he, Raoul, went on his knees to Sir Francis Mulholland to beseech him to sing Rule Britannia, and Sir Francis condescendingly sang it, out of tune, while the francophobe Mr. Ramage played the accompaniment at sight, reduced Lieutenant Lamotte to such helpless laughter, and Miss Hitchings' old spinet to such a condition of discord, that Miss Hitchings herself appeared, to deprecate the holding up of that patriotic air to ridicule, lest the neighbours should hear, and had to be calmed by Raoul's assuring her, with his hand on his heart, that no disrespect was intended to the majestic lady who rose from out the azure main, only to those who murdered so fine a song. But he did not tell Lieutenant Lamotte why he had selected Sir Francis Mulholland as the murderer. Part 1, Chapter 5. Broke Parole. Quote, "The suddenness of the event struck me with surprise, and I was at first rather stupefied than agitated." End quote. Rasselas, Chapter 38. "Shall you be going out this morning, Mr. Rowl?" inquired Miss Hitchings of her lodger not long after breakfast next morning. "Yes, I expect so," responded Raoul rather vaguely, not raising his head from Rasselas. "At what time then, sir, if I may make so bold?" "What time?" repeated the young man. "Oh, about... No, truly, I cannot tell you just when. Does that inconvenience you, Miss Hitchings?" "Not in the least, sir," responded Miss Hitchings, in a tone signifying exactly the opposite. "Oh, I suppose that one more day for the carpet to lie there, so full of dust as it is, it don't signify." "Oh, mon Dieu, were you going to take the carpet up?" cried Raoul, with every symptom of alarm. "Or is it one of those days when everything is dessus-dessous? One of the days of tornado? I am desolated, chère Miss Hitchings, for truly I cannot tell you when I shall be able to... he pulled himself up firmly, when it will suit me to go out." For he was not going to confess to her that he was a prisoner in the house, though he had mentioned the fact to Lamotte over the hare the night before, adding that his confinement need not be taken very seriously. Indeed, he hoped that it would not be long now before Mr. Bannister sent word that he was at liberty. Time to read some more Rasselas, though, as the book was now his own, he had plenty of leisure for that pursuit. And to think that Miss Forrest had not shown him her favourite passages yesterday, after all. They had been too much immersed in conversation, he and she. As he returned to his reading, he recalled the look in her beautiful eyes up in the copse, that thrilling look of deep, deep gratitude and admiration. Oh, ciel! It was already 11:30, and still no word from Mr. Bannister. Perhaps he had not been able to get hold of Sir Francis. Raoul rose and sat himself down at the table with pen and paper and began a letter home. One of those letters whose composition never failed to irritate him a little, for one reason because it was so difficult to find anything new to say, for another because no letter was private. Today he was writing to his sister. Ma chère Adrienne, as-tu pensé à moi hier, car j'ai un peu parlé de toi. Ah, si tu étais ici, je m'ennuierais moi. Nous attraperions des tweets ensemble, comme autrefois. Nous lirions aussi le chef-d'œuvre du célèbre Dr Johnson, l'histoire de Rasselas, que je suis en train d'étudier pour perfectionner mon anglais. Mais un jour, sans doute, nous le lirons ensemble, car mon a fait cadeau du volume. He broke off to mend his pen, beginning softly to whistle, since first I saw your face, while he did so. And before he had finished, he was singing the second verse under his breath. The sun, whose beams most glorious are, rejecteth no beholder, and your sweet beauty past compare made my poor eyes the bolder. When beauty moves and the wit delights, and signs of kindness bind me, there, oh there, where'er I go, I leave my heart behind me. Ah, no, je suis trop prudent pour cela, he observed aloud, shaking his head. Yet, if he were not poor, and an enemy, and a foreigner, and a prisoner, and Miss Forrest were not rich, and English, and affianced to Le Roi Soleil. But in the existing circumstances, though he admired her, and was grateful to her for her friendly kindness, there was no use in contemplating impossibilities. He returned to his letter. Pour le reste, rien de neuf. Je suis, comme toujours, en bonne santé, mais aussi, comme toujours, fixé ici, aussi immuable qu'une épée rouillée dans son fourreau, ou une statue dans sa niche, figée comme du lait caillé. Oh, Mr. Bannister has sent word to say, would you kindly go round to his office at once, Mr. Rowl, came the voice of Miss Hitchings. Oh, with all my heart, exclaimed Raoul, springing up. Oh, in fact, I fly. He hastily put aside his unfinished letter, snatched up his hat, cried, at sight of the bandana tied round his landlady's head and the broom in her hand, "Now you can do your worst in here, Britannia," and went down the stairs 2 at a time. Mr. Bannister's office was full in the High Street and a very short distance away. Yet, by the time that Raoul reached its respectable columned entrance, he had already wondered why the agent had required him to come there, instead of merely sending him a line of release. Perhaps he had been too busy to put pen to paper. Raoul knew the office well, since he had to go there to report himself twice a week, and to draw his allowance on Saturdays. He came briskly round the bookcase, which stood at right angles to the door, making a kind of screen, and said, "Oh, here I am, sir." And then he perceived that the agent was not alone, and that the tall man in riding costume, standing with his back to the room, looking out of the window, was Sir Francis Mulholland. He stopped, displeased. Mr. Bannister himself was standing by his writing table, not far from the same window, turning over some papers in a perfunctory fashion. He was looking so grave that Raoul felt suddenly apprehensive. Oh, had anything gone wrong? But nothing could. "I have sent for you, Monsieur de Sablière," said the agent, and his voice was not the voice of yesterday, "so that you can in person repeat your explanation of your action in going out of bounds yesterday afternoon." Raoul stared at him. "Oh, why should I repeat it, sir? I've nothing to add or to take away from what I've already told you." "Because I should like Sir Francis Mulholland," said Mr. Bannister, glancing for a second at the back of that gentleman, who had not turned round, "to have an opportunity of hearing it from your own lips. Oh, it is only fair." "Oh, fair," repeated Raoul rather stormily. "Oh, fair to whom? And what has Sir Francis to do with the matter, and beyond having denounced me to you? Oh, I should have thought that even a magistrate might have been satisfied with that. Oh, Monsieur de Sablier, I beg of you. Oh, I'm not saying that he exceeded his duty, but he certainly exceeds his rights in being here in the capacity of a judge, and I refuse to recognize him as one. At that, Sir Francis turned round and faced the young Frenchman. Oh, I'm not here, sir, as it happens, in the capacity of a judge, he remarked coolly. I have not the slightest desire to encroach on Mr. Bannister's province. I'm here, as any man might be, in the role of a witness. How unnecessary, sir, said Raoul sharply. Mr. Bannister knows that I instantly acknowledged having been for a short space out of bounds yesterday. Oh, I did not mean as a witness to that physical fact, replied Sir Francis imperturbably. Oh, it would certainly be of small use your denying that. Oh, Sir Francis means, I'm sorry to say, interposed Bannister, looking more and more distressed. Oh, as a witness to the truth of your explanation of the fact. No, Bannister. Sir Francis gave a short laugh. Oh, as a witness to its falsehood, if you please. And as Raoul stared at him, momentarily bereft of speech, he addressed him directly. Now listen, de Sablier, and correct me if I misrepresent what you told Mr. Bannister yesterday. You asserted that at 4:30, Miss Forrest passed you at Folly Bridge, where you were fishing, and that immediately afterwards you heard a scream, rushed up the field to the copse, found that a vagabond was attacking her, and beat him off. Was not that what you asserted to Mr. Bannister? Oh, it is. And then let me tell you, as I've already told your agent, that your explanation is a tissue of lies. No vagabond, or anyone else, could have attacked Miss Forrest in Folly Copse at 4:30, just before I met you, because Miss Forrest was not there to be attacked. Her not there? Miss Forrest not there, stammered Raoul, thinking he had not heard aright. Miss Forrest returned from Northover yesterday afternoon by the Turnpike Road, reaching Mulholland Park at 4:00. Oh, she did not go out again. Oh, it is therefore impossible that she should have passed you at the bridge or been in Folly Copse, and the using of her name in this unwarrantable fashion to cloak whatever you were doing there is very far, let me assure you, from being of assistance to you. For the first moment or two, Raoul was so staggered that he merely said, slowly, "Oh, who told you that lie? That Miss Forrest returned by the high road?" "Oh, I had the information from Miss Forrest herself." Raoul's head whirled. "And when you mentioned the tramp, Oh, why should I mention a tramp to her? Oh, you forget, you told me nothing about one when I met you coming out of the copse. Oh, had not yet invented the story, perhaps." "Oh, invented," cried Raoul hotly. "It is as true as that I'm standing here. Mr. Bannister can witness." "Oh, Mr. Bannister can witness that was the story you told him yesterday, certainly." "But what does that prove?" inquired Sir Francis evenly, and sat down in a chair by the window. "You see, de Sablier," said the agent, with a wrinkled brow, "there's only one person who can prove that you are speaking the truth, though I freely admit that yesterday I thought you were. I mean, of course, Miss Forrest herself. And you hear what she says." "Oh, I do not for one moment believe that Miss Forrest," began Raoul, and then stopped. For in a flash he saw that it was perfectly possible that she had told that paradiddle about her return by the high road in order to shield herself from Sir Francis's jealous expostulations. Only, surely, she had told it without dreaming of the position she had got him into. And by this time she was gone from Wanfield and would never know it. "Oh, come," went on Bannister persuasively. "You cannot stick to that story against the lady's own testimony, can you? I'm not at all anxious to go to extremities with you, de Sablier. Won't you tell me what you were really doing up in the copse? Oh, you had better ask the tramp, if he can be found, answered Raoul defiantly. How exactly, if he can be found, observed Sir Francis, crossing his legs. Why, I have my own ideas about that tramp. We will come to that presently. For the moment, as Miss Forrest's future husband, I ask you to withdraw your use of her name. I will do that only at Miss Forrest's own request, said Raoul, looking him in the face. A safe offer, commented Sir Francis. Miss Forrest, as I expect you're well aware, left Wanfield this morning, and does not even know that you have taken the unwarrantable liberty of using it. And could you not, he continued with the most galling air of distaste, have cloaked your proceedings by somebody else's, some village wenches, if you must be a squire of dames? Raoul's eyes flashed. Mr. Bannister interposed, clutching at this suggestion. Or is it not possible that Monsieur de Sabliac was genuinely mistaken in the lady's identity? He turned to Raoul. Might it not have been some other lady, resembling Miss Forrest, whom you defended in the copse? No, said Raoul stubbornly. It was Miss Forrest herself, and nobody else. But he could have met these attacks so much better if he had not had to think hard all the time, to try to puzzle out while he spoke what Miss Forrest really had said, what she would wish him to say. Had she really kept silence about the tramp? Oh, do not press Monsieur de Sabliac unduly, Mr. Bannister, said Sir Francis with suavity. Where there was no lady, and no tramp, at least not in the form of a tramp, it is putting too great a strain on his powers of invention to call on him to provide another female in distress. The taunt went unheeded. Raoul, his eyes following the pattern of Mr. Bannister's worn carpet, was thinking furiously, while up from the street below floated scraps of an animated conversation between two of his compatriots. The subject seemed to be the price of meat. Was Sir Francis speaking in good faith, or was it conceivable that he was deliberately lying? In either case, if he, Raoul, chose to reveal the fact that Miss Forrest, shortly before the episode, had been neither walking along the turnpike, nor safely ensconced at Mulholland Park, but in his company by the stream, Sir Francis would not have a leg to stand on. And though, in Miss Forrest's absence, that fact would no doubt be disputed, he had it in his power to prove it beyond question. It was lucky, after all, that Satz's son had seen them. He lifted his head. What would you say, Mr. Bannister, he asked crisply, if I told you that I had a witness, an unimpeachable witness, to the identity of the lady and to her whereabouts just before the occurrence? Oh, I should rather want to see the witness before I expressed an opinion, replied Mr. Bannister with some acerbity. He, at least, was plainly not enjoying himself. And Sir Francis Mulholland had suddenly turned in his chair and was gazing out of the window as at something of great interest in the street. The movement attracted Raoul's notice, and he kept his eyes fixed on him, for he felt that if he could only have seen his face at that moment, he might have got some light on the game he was playing. Was he, or was he not, alarmed at the prospect of adverse testimony? When, after a minute or so, the Englishman turned round again, his face unfortunately betrayed nothing, but his tongue was biting. How you really propose, Monsieur de Sabliac, and to call a witness to prove that the lady to whom I have the honor to be engaged is telling a lie. How I thought you claimed to be a gentleman. Oh, if I call him, retorted Raoul, throwing back his head, it will certainly not be against Miss Forrest. Oh, you mean, I presume, that it will be against me, then? Oh, it is the same thing. I speak for Miss Forrest, and Mr. Bannister is satisfied that I do. Oh, produce your witness. Oh, the whole question is, said Raoul in a low voice, eyeing him, whether you do speak for Miss Forrest. Sir Francis surveyed him for a moment, and then shrugged his shoulders. And then we will leave Miss Forrest out of the matter into which she has so improperly been dragged. Who is this witness whose word Mr. Bannister will take before mine? Raoul studied the sunlit carpet once more. If he called the Comte de Saint-Cézanne, the whole affair would come into the light of day. It would have to be elucidated somehow. It would clear him, certainly. But what would be the result? Perhaps merely to show that though Miss Forrest had seen fit to hide her meeting with him by means of a fib, and even, just possibly, had done so to shield him from the effects of her betrothed's jealousy. He, of all men, had been unchivalrous enough to drag the cloak off her shoulders. And even if the testimony proved it was Sir Francis who was doing the lying, yet, in the esclandre that must ensue, all Wanfield would know that he and Miss Forrest had been seen, not just conversing openly on the bridge, but some way down the stream, conveniently remote from the public gaze, and by no means on the route to Mulholland Park. For though Raoul felt, as he had felt at the time, that the Comte was too well-bred and too discreet to blazon abroad his knowledge of that fact, once his testimony to it was demanded, it would not be much of a step to the discovery of an arranged meeting, of manoeuvres on Miss Forrest's part. He could not bring that upon her. No, his feet were entangled every way. Well, who is it? Demanded Mr. Bannister with some impatience. On reflection, I shall not call him, said Raoul slowly. You are well advised, observed Sir Francis. How English law, you may not know it, and does not smile on perjury. And now, having disposed of your fictitious companion in folly copse, let Mr. Bannister, that is, hear what you were doing there with your real one. Raoul gave an impatient movement and turned his back on him. I've nothing more to say. Mr. Bannister, cannot this farce come to an end? Even though I'm not believed when I tell the truth, I'm not going to invent falsehoods to stand a better chance of pleasing Sir Francis Mulholland. But de Sablière, said his shepherd very gravely, on Sir Francis's showing, you have already invented them. Oh, this is not a farce. I've every right to ask you for the real explanation of your presence in the copse, out of bounds. Oh, I've already given it to you, said Raoul with suppressed passion. As Monsieur de Sablière suggests, this farce had better end, put in Sir Francis. Oh, I will give you the real explanation, Mr. Bannister. He was there to meet an escape agent, and I can tell you who the agent was. Zachary Miller, the peddler. Raoul laughed. There seemed nothing else to do. Oh, why not suggest that I went to meet the Emperor himself in Folly Copse? Oh, that is only a suspicion of yours, Sir Francis, said the agent, shaking his head. Oh, you cannot prove it, I think. Not yet, perhaps, but I may be able to. Zachary Miller was seen near Four Oaks Farm at 3 o'clock yesterday afternoon, talking to 2 Frenchmen, and he can give no satisfactory account of his movements between that time and 4:30. And, as you know, he rests under very strong suspicion of being concerned in the escape traffic in these parts, and though nothing can be proved against him. So 2 points that cannot be proved, observed Raoul mockingly. You're not altogether lucky, Sir Francis, in your efforts to get rid of me. He was becoming reckless. What do you mean, sir? Demanded his enemy, turning on him angrily. Do you suggest that I am allowing personal motives to weigh with me in this matter? Oh, I don't suggest, I know, retorted Raoul. The only question in my mind is to what lengths you have gone in that direction. Of that, your own conscience is the best judge. Will you allow me to speak to Monsieur de Sablière alone? Asked Mr. Bannister, intervening rather hastily at this point. I think it would be better. Sir Francis immediately took up his hat and riding whip. I will withdraw altogether, my dear Bannister. My unpleasant task is done. I've shown you that Monsieur de Sablière's alleged reason for going out of bounds is a pure invention, and a clumsy one at that, besides not reflecting much credit upon him. And in my capacity as a justice of the peace, I warn you of what I'm convinced was his real reason. However, as I understand it, the mere fact of broken parole is in itself sufficient. I've every confidence that you will do your duty. Good morning. And the door shut behind him. Well, are you going to do your duty, as Sir Francis orders you? Inquired Raoul after a moment. But Mr. Bannister was walking up and down with bent head and did not answer. Why did you say you wanted to see me alone? Went on the young man. I have nothing different to tell you, nor, since Sir Francis has poisoned your mind against me, would you believe it if I had? Mr. Bannister stopped his pacing. Oh, my mind is not poisoned against you, de Sablière. I am more grieved and disappointed over this affair than I can say. Oh, but how can I take your word against Sir Francis Mulholland's? If you'd only been frank with me. I have been, to very little purpose. Oh, how can you call that being frank? Asked the agent reproachfully. Oh, to tell me an impossible and yet specious story about a lady and a tramp, which the very next day is unmasked as a falsehood. If you'd said straightforwardly that you had yielded to a not unnatural temptation to go out of bounds for a few moments, I might have stretched a point and let you off with a fine. But the motive which requires so preposterous a tale to cover it. He paused. Yes, I see, said Raoul bitterly. Next time that I'm in a difficulty, I must remember that the one thing not to do is to tell the truth. Oh, but I suppose your kind intention is to deliver me now from the possibility of getting into any more such difficulties. And, though he threw out this feeler with a certain airy defiance, his heart was beating pretty rapidly. I cannot help myself, returned the agent shortly. You have broken your parole, and will not tell me why. The interpretation which Sir Francis puts upon your action cannot be proved, but since you will give me no other that satisfies me, it always remains a possibility. I should not, therefore, be worthy of the trust which I hold, if I let you continue at large. In accordance with the standing orders which I have received from the Transport Office, I must send you to Norman Cross Depot, if they have room to receive you, which I shall ascertain without delay. If not, to Stapleton Prison or elsewhere. Meanwhile, he approached the bell rope on the wall. I'm afraid that I must send you to the lock-up here. Raoul had turned a little pale, but at that the color swept over his face again. How could I not go back to my lodgings until you hear from Norman Cross? He asked. I would give you my word, as yesterday, not to leave them. I cannot take your word now, I'm sorry to say, replied Mr. Bannister sadly. And as you are no longer a prisoner on parole, I'm unable to grant you that indulgence. I've a militia guard here. The best advice I can give you is not to cause a disturbance. You shall not stay in jail an hour longer than is necessary, that I can promise you. But still he did not ring the bell to summon the guard. He was giving Raoul a last chance before the net closed about him. The young man was conscious of that. He had only to mention Saint-Saëns's name. For a moment he hesitated, struck by the idea that he might make some kind of compromise. Tell Bannister of the interview by the stream, but say that he did not wish the information to go further. For it was a real grief to him to lose his shepherd's regard, and needlessly. But Bannister was too honest a man to send him to prison if he believed him innocent. Yet, if he did not, the agent would be forced to justify his action to Sir Francis, at least, and the whole meeting by the stream would become public, after all. Oh, if he could only be sure that Miss Forrest had not fibbed, that it was Sir Francis, incredible as it seemed, who was lying. Yet, because there was the chance that she had done so, there was nothing for it but to uphold her and take his punishment in silence. For though Sir Francis Mulholland affected to doubt it, he did claim to be a gentleman. "Thank you for that promise, sir," he said, and shut his mouth rather tightly. "And that is all you have to say?" asked Bannister, his hand on the bell rope. "That is all," said Raoul, and the agent rang the bell. So, a minute and a half later, Mr. Rowl went through the door of that well-known office for the last time, and presently afforded all Wanfield the spectacle of yet another French officer being marched off under arrest. The thronged High Street stared and sniggered, while from all quarters came joyfully clattering small boys, crying out that epithet which he had vowed should never be applied to him. A broke parole, broke parole. And outside the post office, for the last drop in the cup, was standing the Comte de Saint-Suzanne, leaning on his cane. Their looks met, for Raoul flung up his head defiantly. A fleeting expression, which began as sorrow and ended as scorn, went over the old man's face. Then he turned his back on him